Okay, good evening, everybody. Tonight's Wednesday night, so it's another halacha and Tanya class. 2 weeks ago, last week we didn't have a class. So 2 weeks ago we were learning about, again, the kitchen dinim of meat and milk getting mixed up. And, you cook meat in a milk pot, milk in a meat pot, all the various different dinim. Last time we started a little bit, but we're going to have to start again. And that is as follows. What happens if somebody cuts a hot piece of meat with a dairy knife, a milchik knife, that was used within 24 hours for dairy? Okay? So there's a hot roast, boiling hot. They take by mistake a dairy knife and they cut the roast. And we're talking in this case is when the knife was used that day within 24 hours for dairy. So it's a fresh taste of dairy, cutting a hot roast. So the din is like this. If there is 60 times the meat against the blade of the knife that touched the meat, in other words, sometimes you just touch, let's say the blade is 4 inches long, and you only touched 2 inches of the blade in the meat. So then you need 60 times the 2 inches of the blade. If you did the whole blade, then you would need 60 times 4 inches of the blade. If you don't know, then you have to assume that you used the whole blade, but not the handle. So in other words, you're cutting a hot roast with a dairy knife that was used that day for dairy. So the din is, if there's 60 times the meat against the size of the knife, the meat is kosher. But the meat is kosher, you have 60 times. So the taste of dairy that went into the milk, into the meat, the taste of dairy that went into the meat by cutting it is nullified in 60. Nevertheless, you have to cut off a thin place of the where the knife cut. Let's say you have a roast and you're cutting the roast in half, okay? And you have 60 times the roast against the blade of the knife. Nevertheless, the place where the knife cut, you need to cut off a very, very thin strip on both sides. Why do you have to cut off a thin strip on both sides? The meat is kosher. But the place where the knife touched, you're going to have to peel it on both sides where the knife touched. Why? Because there's a concept in halacha, we just started learning this last week, what's called 2 weeks ago, durke de sakina. Durke de sakina means the pressure of the blade. If I stir soup, the fleishik soup with a meat spoon, so there's no pressure. It's just meat and milk mixing together. So if you have 60 times the amount, it's fine. But here you're cutting a hard piece of meat with a dairy knife. So even though you have 60 times the blade, but because it was ben yemei, and it wasn't, even if it wasn't ben yemei, you need to cut off a thin strip on both sides where the knife cut. Because of the pressure, it went in a little bit. So you have to cut that off. What happened if the knife wasn't used for 24 hours for dairy? You take a clean dairy knife, was not used for 24 hours for hot dairy, and then you cut the roast with it. So obviously the roast is entirely kosher because it's not a real taste of milk. It's a blemished taste of milk going into the meat. So a blemished taste of milk in meat doesn't make a problem, like we learned a number of times already. Nevertheless, you have to cut off a thin piece where the blade touched. Again, because of the pressure of the knife. So again, the case is you're cutting a meat, a roast with a dairy knife. If the dairy knife was used within 24 hours for dairy, you need 60 times in the meat against the blade of the knife. And then you still need to peel off a little bit. If the knife if it wasn't 60 times the amount, what happens, you cut the meat, and there's no 60 times the blade. It was a smaller piece of meat. The whole meat is treif. Because the knife was used that day for dairy within 24 hours. It's a fresh taste of dairy now going into the meat, and you don't have 60 times the amount. You don't have 60 times the amount, so then all the meat is treif.
It's only if it's hot.
Only if it's hot. We'll learn in a second a little bit what is the din if the meat is not hot. Okay? Bottom line is the meat has to be hot. If the knife was used within 24 hours and there's 60 times the amount, the meat is kosher. You have to cut off a little piece at the end, in the middle where you cut. If there is no 60 times the amount of the blade, the whole meat is treif. If the knife was not used within 24 hours and is clean, so then the whole meat is kosher. But because of the pressure of the knife, you need to cut off a little bit, like you say, they creep, it's called, you have to peel off both sides where the knife touched. The knife obviously is treif because it's a dairy knife that became meat from the hot meat. So that's a problem. So the knife in all cases would be treif, whether the knife was used that day or not used that day. The knife itself is a dairy knife that not now came in contact with hot meat, and therefore it would be a problem. Now, what happens halachically? We mentioned this before. What happens if you don't know? You just don't know if it was used within 24 hours. Somebody called me today with a kitchen shayla. I remember exactly what it was. But he said, we don't know if it was used within 24 hours or not. Halacha says, if you don't know, we assume it wasn't. If we don't know if it was used for 24 hours, within 24 hours or not, we assume it wasn't. And therefore, you don't need 60 times in the meat. If the meat is kosher, you have to cut off a little bit, where you cut it. And obviously, the knife needs to be kosher in boiling hot water. Hagala. Okay, now, that is it. Now, let's discuss another din in connection with this knife story. What happens if somebody has a block of cheese? We mentioned it very briefly. What happens if somebody had a cold block of cheese and by mistake they cut the cheese with a meat knife? Clean, there's no heat, but the knife's clean, and you cut the cheese with the dairy knife, and it's cold. I mean, you're cutting the cheese with a meat knife. A meat knife, the cheese obviously is dairy. So then again, it says you also cut off a little bit where the knife cut because it's pressure of the knife going into the cheese. But how do you kosher the knives? We started discussing this 2 weeks ago. Now, there's no heat. We learned already many times that what transfers one thing to the next is heat. If somebody's going to take a clean meat spoon and stir a cup of cold milk, it's not a problem. Wash it off, and it's fine. In cold water, you wash it off because there's no transfer of meat to milk and milk to meat because it's cold. Cold doesn't do anything. But when there's pressure of the knife, even though it's cold, there is pressure that's making a little bit of the knife going into the cheese, so you need to cut off a little piece at the end. Now, how do you kosher the knife? So the general rule by koshering, we learned many times, is the way it became treif, that's the way you kosher it. So how do you kosher a knife that became treif with cold pressure? So the din is you have to stick it 10 times into hard ground. Hard ground that when you stick the knife in, there's pressure. So sticking it into 10 different places in the earth, and the earth is hard, that pressure takes out from the knife the cheese that went into the knife because of the pressure. So you don't need any hot, no heat. You don't have to kosher with hot, and you don't have to do that. I'll give you another example that somebody called me today about, but these are daily questions that come up. Their housekeeper, by mistake, washed the meat and the dairy dishes together. This is a question. I came home, I saw my housekeeper washed my meat dishes and my dairy dishes together in the sink, or the cutlery, the plates, whatever. So now, what's the din? So number one, the first question you need to ask is, was the water hot or warm? Because if the water was warm, not hot, I'll explain what that means in a second. If the water was warm and not hot, nothing ever transferred from one thing to the next. Because if you're washing the meat and the dishes and the dairy dishes together, the only thing that can transfer from meat to dairy and dairy to meat is heat. But if the water is not hot, then there's no transfer. So in that case, there's not an issue. You have to throw out the sponge because the sponge now got dirty from meat and milk. So you're going to have to throw out the sponge, okay, which is not a big deal. But if the housekeeper or anybody else in the house by mistake washed the dishes together, meat and milk together, so again, if the water is not hot, basically it's not a problem because there's no transfer. How do you know in a practical way? I mean, what is called hot? Okay, what is called hot? 110 degrees Fahrenheit. 110 degrees is called hot, 110 and above. Now, many opinions in halacha just say yatsa ledesvei, that's the expression, the hand will get burnt, means you can't leave your hand in the water for an extended period of time because it's too hot. But if it's warm water that you're able to leave your hand in the water, then you have to assume halachically the water was not hot, it was only warm, so there's not an issue. So sometimes they say, yeah, they use hot water. The housekeepers or whoever it is, I used hot water. Now the question is like this: did you wash with your hands or did you wash with gloves? If you wash with your hands, halachically the water can't be that hot because your hand couldn't be in it for a long time if it's hot. I'll answer that question in a second. So if you're washing with your hands, then the water can't be hot, so you have no shaila. The shaila is if the water was very hot and your hot water in the sink, taki gets very hot that you can't keep your hand in there. And they were using gloves, so then you need to call a shaila because that's complicated already. And you're going to have to figure out if you could be lenient under certain circumstances. But generally speaking, if the housekeeper or whoever it is did not use hot water, only warm water, and you know that if they were able to keep their bare hands in the water for an extended period of time, that means the water is not hot. Now the question is, the issue with the knife, is it because it's sharp or not? No, this thing that I'm talking now, sharp food we're going to get to later, it's a whole different concept by itself. We're talking about a meat knife cutting cold cheese. Cheese is not sharp. Sharp is onions, garlic, lemon, pickles, ginger. It's sharp according to many opinions. Things that are sharp is not a piece of cheese. A piece of cheese is not sharp, unless if it's so spiced up with sharp things, then maybe. But generally speaking, it's not only because it's sharp. It's the pressure of the knife, which is meat, is cutting into the cheese. And the cheese is a block of cheese. It's pressure. It's not a loose piece of cheese. You know, if you take a meat spoon and eat cottage cheese with it, then there's no pressure. Or I'll give you another example in the reverse. You're cutting a cold piece of chicken. Yeah, you have a chicken. You're opening it, you know, you're open up the chicken. Yeah, get it ready for dinner. and you take a dairy knife by mistake and you're cutting the chicken. Over there, there's also pressure. When you cut a chicken, you're cutting, with pressure to cut. So because it's, again, pressure, so if you use a dairy knife to cut chicken, then again, the chicken is good. You have to cut off a little piece where the knife cut. But then you're gonna, the knife is gonna have to be stuck into the ground 10 times. Because again, it absorbs through cold. Okay, let's go again to some more to other practical dinim that are going around in the kitchen. Okay. Until now, we were learning you cook meat in a milk pot, the milk in a meat pot, and you cut things. That we're learning about that. Now we're going into another very practical question that comes up in the kitchen. You're cooking meat. You're cooking milk in a pot. Milk pot, you're cooking milk. And a piece of meat, a mistake, falls into the pot of hot milk. A piece of meat falls into the pot. So if there is 60 times the milk against the meat, the milk is kosher but you need 60 times a whole piece of meat. Okay, so let's say you have an ounce of meat fell into a pot of soup that's dairy. So if you have 1 ounce of meat and you have 60 ounces of soup, so then you have nullified in 60. Obviously, the piece of meat must be taken out. That meat is treif because meat fell into a hot pot of milk. So the meat for sure is treif. It has to be removed and thrown out. There's no way it's meat, it's treif. But the milk, if there's 60 times in the milk against the piece of size of the meat, so then it's kosher. The milk is kosher, you can eat the soup or the milk, whatever it is. Now, what's this number 60? It's interesting because in the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch, they also give a second option. The bottom line is like this. If you have a taste, and this is something you need to know for here on, so to speak. If there's a taste of meat in the milk, then obviously it's meat and milk together. If there's taste of milk in meat, then obviously it's meat and milk together. How do you know if there's a taste of meat or milk? So the Gemara says you give it to a guy to taste. And the guy tastes the meat. And if he tastes milk in it, it's treif. If he tastes milk in the meat, it's treif. Or meat in the milk, whichever one. If he tastes it, you give it to a chef that knows food. And if he tastes it, it's treif. But the problem, we don't do that today. So halacha says the number 60. What's the concept of 60 times the amount? The Chachamim evaluated, and this is it. Whether scientifically will be proven differently, more or less, it's totally irrelevant. Torah says that up to 60 times the amount, it gives taste. It's 59.9% times the amount, it's going to be treif. If it's 60 times the amount, then it's 100% kosher. I'll tell you where this is a very common scenario, and we always, all the Rabbanim get many calls about this. Somebody is cooking, I don't know why, they shouldn't be doing it, but they do it. They have a bigger stove, so they're cooking meat and milk. They're cooking on one side of the stove, they're cooking milchiks, and the other side of the stove, they're cooking fleishiks. And, they're not thinking, and they just mix chicken soup with a spoon, and then without realizing, they took the same spoon that they just mixed hot chicken soup, and they mixed the macaroni and cheese. It happens a lot, by the way. So now is the macaroni and cheese kosher or not? Or I'll take it even a step further. Even if there's no macaroni and cheese, there's only macaroni. But the question is, does that macaroni become meat? Does it become fleishik? So again, the din is, if you have in the amount that the spoon went into the food, if you stir the macaroni with a dirty fleishik knife that you just stirred chicken soup with, and you didn't wash it off in the middle. If you have 60 times in the macaroni corresponding with the part of the spoon that went into the macaroni, if you have 60 times in the macaroni, then it's fine. It remains parve. If there's milk in it, it's not a problem. Everything's fine. If you don't have 60 times the amount, then it's treif. Not only is the macaroni and cheese treif, but then the pot, which is the dairy pot, becomes treif. So if somebody by mistake took a meat spoon that they just used to stir chicken soup, and they mixed on the same fire, neighboring fire, they mixed a pot in a milchik pot. They mixed macaroni and cheese or any other milchiks, whatever it is. If the macaroni and cheese has 60 times the amount of the spoon that went into the food, then it's kosher. If not, it's treif, and the pot is treif, plus the spoon the fleishik spoon that you just put into the milchik pot also became treif. So if there's no 60 times, in other words, you're making chicken soup. You stir the chicken soup. You take that same spoon right away, and you mix macaroni and cheese or any other milchik food. So the din is like this: if there's 60 times in the milchiks against the part of the spoon that went into the soup, then the din is the macaroni and cheese is kosher, the dairy pot is kosher, but the knife is treif, because it was a meat knife that just went into dairy. What happened if you were cooking parve? There's no cheese, there was macaroni. And you stirred the macaroni with, by mistake, a dirty fleishik knife. If you don't have 60 times in the macaroni against the side of the spoon that went into the macaroni is fleishik, meaning you cannot eat it with milk. It's mamish fleishik. If you eat it, you're going to have to wait 6 hours. Now, the question is, what with the pot? If the pot is parve, that pot might become fleishik. You'd have to kosher it to become back fleishik, back to parve. I mean, that you might have to do it. But otherwise you can have a big problem. So people, b'chlal, I always tell people, never cook on the stove at the same time meat and milk. Even though you have 6 burners and you're cooking on the opposite, inevitably people forget. They don't think something's happening. You would start mixing things and you make big problems. Halachically big problems with that. So people have to be very, very careful that, not to be mixing anything of meat and anything of milk at the same time, because it's problematic. Okay, but the concept of 60, is the Chachamim said, and again, this is halacha, that if there's more than 60 times, it's nullified. If it's less than 60 times, it's not nullified. Okay, so now what happens? You're cooking meat and potatoes. You're cooking a chon. No, together in a pot. You're making a chon. You're cooking meat and potatoes in a pot. And a drop of milk or some milk falls into the pot. Now you need 60 times the milk, but you don't only need 60 times in the meat. Even the whole pot, everything that's in the pot is counted as 60 times the amount. So even though, let's say, the milk fell mamish to the piece of meat in the chon, but the fact that it's all cooking together, all the food in the pot combines to make sure it's 60 times the amount of the milk. And if it's 60 times the amount of the milk, then it's kosher. Then it's fine. You have to kosher the spoon, correct? Because the spoon Well, no, I'm not saying you're not stirring anything. Some milk fell into the meat, into the cholent. Somebody was drinking milk and they, people spill things. So they spilled it into the cholent. So then every part of the cholent is counting for 60 that you can get rid of it. What happens if it wasn't? Okay. What happens, and this one last thing we'll learn, and then we'll go to Tanya. What happens? You're cooking meat. You're cooking 5 pieces of meat in a pan, and milk falls onto a piece of meat. And you don't have 60 times the amount. So every piece of meat, because you don't have 60 times the amount, is treif. Because there's a taste of milk in the meat. What happens now if this meat falls into another pot of meat? Do you need 60 times the original amount of milk that fell into the meat? Or do you need 60 times the pieces of meat that fell into the other meat? You understand the point? The question is, this pot of meat became treif. Now, but because there's a taste of milk, but it's not nullified in 60. Let's see, it's nullified in 50, but it's still treif. Now, this meat falls into another pot of meat. Do you need 60 times the original milk only? Or now you need 60 times the new piece of meat? And the halacha is, according to all opinions, by meat and milk. In Hebrew, it's called the expression chaticha nasis nevela. This piece became treif. So it's not that there's milk. The whole piece became a treif entity. And therefore, if this piece of meat is now going to fall into another pot of meat, you're going to need 60 times in the new pot of meat against the piece of meat that became treif from that old pot. And if not, that whole old pot, the new pot is also all treif. So in other words, this meat that didn't have 60 times against the milk, this piece of meat itself becomes completely treif. So if that falls into something, you're going to need 60 times, not the original milk that made it treif, but you're going to need 60 times this piece of meat to make the second pot of meat kosher. I just want to go back. I just remind myself, I want to go back to what we said before. You're making chicken soup and you're making dairy. And you take the chicken soup spoon and you mix the dairy with it. Okay? And there's no 60 times the amount. Now, without thinking, you take the same spoon and put it back into the chicken soup. This is what you did. You're cooking chicken soup and you're cooking milk. You take the meat spoon, stick it into the milk, yeah, and then you stick it back into the chicken soup. Guess what? You got a lot of problems. Each thing needs to be 60 times everything else because it's all treif now. That spoon became treif because the halachic spoon going into a milk pot, so it became treif. Now you're taking that spoon back into the chicken soup. It has milk. Now it has milk on it. So you basically have a big messed up kitchen. Anyway, okay, let's go to Tanya to be continued in Mitzvah Shem next week.